Oh man, look at that. Welcome back to another episode of the Rain Race podcast. It's been, I'll tell you what, about 2 years since we've done the last episode. I'm going to say it's kind of an all new format. The only similarity here that remains the same is this guy right here. But new look, actually a video now. What's going on? If you're still listening on an audio platform, that's great. That's fantastic. We'll still be on the same podcasting platforms as before. But for YouTube now, we do have an actual visual format. We're off to a great start. So that you can actually see something other than a static screen. Nice part is we're still live, so you can comment any questions that you have throughout the episode, and we'll try to get to those. One of the major changes, though, throughout this new iteration of the Rain Race podcast is I have a new guest here, over here on this side. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Chris. I am, of course, Stu from off in the Esses. Some of you may or may not have seen my work before, but yeah, really excited. Whenever you reached out about doing this, it just makes sense. It just makes sense. There's so much news and there's so much to talk about in the sports car world right now, particularly with the WEC and IMSA, and super excited to be able to do this.
Yeah, and I think, I sort of echoed the exact same thing. There's been so many topics over the past 2 years since I've been off this podcast that I've just really wanted a place to talk about. The WEC, IMSA right now are just booming with news. It's kind of ironic that the first week we go back here, we're short of news lists on stories to talk about. But I think that that's going to be kind of a rarity for this podcast. So on that note, one of the other big changes to this podcast is it is now primarily a WEC and IMSA focused podcast. So I say good 98% of the things we're going to talk about here are going to be IMSA related, WEC related. I'm sort of the WEC guy in the house here. I know Stu over here off in the Esses is quite the IMSA connoisseur, so we're going to let him handle a lot of those things. But that's pretty much it. We're going to talk a lot about IMSA and WEC on this show. If that's what you're into, that's great. I know that's, when I look at the podcast analytics from previous episodes, a huge portion of them, of the popular episodes, were centered around sports car racing topics. So that's what I sort of decided. Let's just run with that. We'll focus on those two series in general, and then we'll take it from there. So if nothing else, we're going to start off today. The first thing I want to talk about is BMW had a test last week at Spa-Francorchamps from Wednesday to Friday. They were testing two cars at that test. They were testing the BMW M Hybrid V8 in the hands of BMW M Team WRT, and they were testing the all-new, yet to be run formally, BMW M4 GT3 Evo. And Stu, I was talking to you about this yesterday. It's kind of crazy that we're already talking about an Evo kit BMW, because the regular M4 just started racing at the beginning, I guess technically the end of 2021 with the 24 Hours of Sebring, but IMSA debut, and I guess for the rest of the global scene at the beginning of 2022.
Yeah, it's wild. You think about it, and I don't know if maybe the COVID years that we've lost have kind of warped our perception of time a little bit, but a year and a half after a year and a half really of this track or of this car being in competition, we're already talking about an Evo kit coming out, and it's pretty interesting some of the key improvements that they're looking at making with it. Improve the customer racing aspects of it. So for the customer drivers that, aren't driving it all the time, try and make it a little bit easier for them to get a handle on, improve things like tire wear. It's interesting to hear some of the things that they're really looking to focus in on with an Evo kit that they're not, I don't think they were testing it, as you mentioned last week, but I don't think they were. I don't think they have everything finalized for it yet. I certainly don't think they're going to be going into production until next year.
Right. So they're scheduling an on-track debut for 2025. I'll throw a card on the table and say probably around the 2025 Rolex 24. Although I think the 24 Hours of Dubai, if it ends up racing in that series, might be around a week before. I guess it depends on the year, but. The other thing I was talking about is that it's not entirely uncommon, as crazy as it sounds, for these Evo kit cars to come out within a few years of the original car. I mean, we saw an Evo kit from Lamborghini come out this year. We had an Evo kit 488, and now we have the 296 GT3. We've gone through multiple iterations of the Porsche 911 GT3R in the past few years. Audi had their second Evo kit come out last year, I believe, 2022. And then they had another Evo car before that one that came out in 2019, I believe, 2018 maybe.
I think Mercedes had one in 21.
Mercedes has an Evo. Yep. So I guess this is the name of the game with GT3 racing right now. It's certainly a lot more fast paced than it used to be. We're seeing a lot more new cars than we had previously. I guess I'm sort of used to the earlier days of GT3 racing, especially with stateside. We had the Cadillac CTS VR, which raced for a handful of years. You had some of the early GT3 cars like the Audi R8 LMS race for probably a good 5 years before a new one came out. Sort of a change in tides from GT3 standpoint.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if it's the increase in customer racing that there's so many more series that you can run this GT3 spec car in right now, and I wonder if one of the big focuses that Porsche put into their new release this year was making this easy to service from a customer racing perspective and from a customer driver perspective, not necessarily for the pros, but making sure that's easy to pick up. And you got to wonder if lots of these Evo kits are making large strides to help address that. I mean, us not being drivers or anything, it's only for us to speculate.
No drivers, no engineers here. Yeah. Yet. You got a news story?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll keep our eyes on that one. Obviously, that car very, very likely to be racing them, so almost a certainty, as long as nothing wild happens. And then also potentially racing in the FIA World Endurance Championship as well with their transition over to GT3. I'd certainly expect that one as well. In terms of the M Hybrid V8, the drivers for that test were Robin Freins, who is now a BMW factory driver, as weird as that is for me to say. Switching from the Audi camp. And same thing for Rene Rast as well, also now a BMW factory driver. Also in the lineup was Maxime Martin, Marco Wittmann, and Nick Yellowly driving that car for Team WRT. Like I said, that was a 3-day test, and WRT, of course, is the team that will be running that car in the FIA World Endurance Championship next year for a 2-car full season program. Continuing their testing miles on that car, I believe they tested that car in the past at Aragon. I'm pretty sure there was another track in there as well. I just can't remember off the top of my head, but getting some early-ish testing miles on that car. And WRT, as we'll talk about later, certainly an extremely strong team. They were the team that was supposed to be running the Audi LMDH program, rest in peace, that sort of went to the wayside. Supposed to be running in this year in the hypercar category, but ultimately with the whole Audi situation had to push it back a year. But now they have a new partner in BMW. They're continuing their GT3 program with BMW and also have the prototype program now beginning next year as well.
And that car, that black carbon or that black livery it had on it looked very nice out on track as well.
Yeah, no, I've always said that, there's not as much of a case for it for prototype racing because they have BoP, which, we'll talk about that a little bit later, where they're not trying to shed every single kilogram possible. They also have a minimum weight that they have to meet. But man, I would love to see some carbon liveries for prototypes. I think that they just look fantastic on track. And also talking of carbon liveries, they also had the Penske Porsche 963, the number 5 WEC test car out on track at the same test at Spa. There were no official drivers, to my knowledge, that were announced for that test, although I do know for a fact that Andre Lauder and Kevin Estre are both present for that one. I don't know if there's a third driver on hand for that one, but just Penske Porsche getting some additional testing miles on that car as well for the WEC side of things. Additional testing miles at a high-speed track. Don't know if that's entirely relevant to their performance at Le Mans or their performance at Fuji, which is going to be coming up this weekend, which is another high-speed track, but Porsche is certainly still leading the running for testing miles out on track right now.
Yeah, they put in a ton of testing miles in the off season, and the testing never ends. It always amazes me how much teams go off and schedule tests. In the weeks, the days between races. It's wild how much track time those cars get, and yeah, it was. You always see there was a bunch of cars testing, I think, at VIR this week, and always amazing how that turns out. But yeah, the Porsche Penske, the 963. It's unfortunately the races aren't won in testing, because otherwise they'd probably be lapping the field right now.
It's very interesting because I was talking to a friend the other week about IMSA's testing rules, which are extremely confusing right now to me. Maybe we'll do a
Yes.
whole episode on their testing rules. I don't know how interesting that would be, but I feel like we're seeing a lot more on track testing right now, and I don't know if that's partially down to IMSA's testing rules, but also due to the fact that we now have the same exact cars racing in two different series. So you see an on track test at Indianapolis for the 963. The following week, you see an on track test for the 963 at Spa, but they're both testing under two completely, I guess I'll say, different teams. They're Penske's IMSA team and Penske's WEC team. But they're both racing in different series. So I feel like we're seeing a lot more on-track testing this year than previously.
Yeah, I was looking into it because I was wondering the same thing, and I took a look at the regulations, and I think there's team specific tests that you can do, and there's also manufacturer tests that you can do, and then everybody's allocated a certain number of them for the season. And it is, as with many things sports car racing, it can be pretty confusing once you start digging into it.
Right. And I think that's because I'd seen the exact same thing. The teams have a certain number of days they can test. The manufacturers also have a certain number of days they can test. Now, that becomes a little bit interesting because if you have a customer program, a heavy customer program like Porsche has right now, where you have two customer teams, they're going to get more on-track testing time just due to the fact that they have more teams running that car. I don't know if they're allowed to share that data with Porsche themselves and with the other Porsche teams, but something to consider, I guess.
Certainly is. Certainly is.
Yep.
Well, we were
The
talking.
other.
Oh,
Oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was going to move on to our IMSA LMP2 news.
Go ahead.
All right. So Scott McLaughlin, this was some pretty. We mentioned that there wasn't much IMSA news that came out in the past week or so, but there was a very interesting announcement about driver for Petit Le Mans and Scott McLaughlin. So he has been confirmed for the Tower Motorsports LMP2 car, and that car will be featuring a new Acumatica. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Livery.
I think you got it.
Pretty nailed it. Pretty nice helmet to go along with it. If I will say so. McLaughlin is, of course, looking to defend his victory in his previous IMSA outing at the Rolex 24. At the 12 Hours of Sebring. He did not win the Rolex 24. He'll be running along Kippen Simpson. Of course, Kippen Simpson been with Tower Motorsports for the season. And they're still waiting on the confirmation of a third driver. John Ferrano has not raced since his accident at Laguna Seca, taking a step back from racing. So hopefully we'll see John back in the car at some point, but unconfirmed who that third driver will be. But anytime you see Scott McLaughlin hopping in a car, he's going to be quick. Proved it at Petit Le Mans, where they picked up a victory, and just a very strong driver to add to an already strong lineup.
Right. And of course, McLaughlin's teammate from Daytona, Joseph Newgarden, and this was announced a few weeks back, but he will be racing his GTP debut in the number 7 Penske Motorsports Porsche 963, replacing Michael Christensen, who raced in that car at both Daytona and Sebring. Now, this brings up an interesting question for me, because I was thinking about this earlier today when I was reading through our show notes. Scott McLaughlin and Joseph Newgarden have both obviously been higher presence in sports car racing this year in the prototype scene. Now, what this makes me wonder, because Joseph Newgarden will be making his Porsche debut at Petit Le Mans, like I said, I'm wondering if it's a bit in the cards right now for a third car at the Rolex 24 next year, with maybe a certain IndyCar driver prominent lineup. I'll just say Joseph Newgarden and Scott McLaughlin, obviously. The reason I say that, obviously, they had the third car at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. I don't know what that would look like for the Rolex 24. I don't know if they would bring one of the WEC cars overseas or if they would just run with their testing car. But it's been something on my mind right now. it just sort of makes me wonder when you have an increased presence of these Penske IndyCar drivers in sports car racing. Maybe it's a pure coincidence, but maybe it's not because, like I said, we saw the exact thing with Newgarden right now. People are saying, well, Newgarden's racing for Tower Motorsports. How long is it going to be until he gets that 963 seat? I sort of wonder the same thing with McLaughlin.
Yeah, I mean, McLaughlin has been vocal for a little while. I think that he is wanted to race the 963, and I think he did a test at Road America earlier this year, and all the reports were good coming out of that. So I think that your question that you posed there, could this mean a third, Porsche Penske 963 at the Rolex 24? I think it would be a pretty realistic. I think that would be a realistic, ask, or a realistic expectation, anyways, to see it there. I mean, they ran the third entry at Le Mans. I think it's just going to be a matter of, is IMSA going to allow them on for a one-off entry for the Rolex 24? With it being such a prominent team like Porsche Penske, you would think that they'd have as good of a better chance than most at being able to do that. Yeah, it's a lineup where you have Joseph Newgarden and Scott McLaughlin and maybe another IndyCar driver, maybe pair it up with a couple of their WEC drivers. That'd be a pretty strong Rolex 24 team, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason I wonder that is because, this is something that's been in the cards right now for. I just wonder if that's going to be something that they consider, because obviously there's going to be a big increase of interest if they have that IndyCar lineup. For a North American event, I think the only thing that Rolex 24 is missing is a little bit of incentive for viewers to continue watching it. I think that if they can get that push to get that additional car on the field, then that would certainly be something worth investigating. Now, you say you wonder if they would include that extra car, if IMSA would allow it. Do you wonder if that's because of just car count issues right now, where you have so much interest in the race right now that they might not have room for it?
Yeah, I mean, we saw it last year with the 10 car wait list, that they were already oversubscribed, and we're always crossing our fingers that we're gonna get maybe a couple more customer Porsche 963s on the grid next year, and you would expect those to be full season entries. IMSA is always going to prioritize the full season entries over any one-off entry. So you just look at how the field is starting to build up. The GTD field is going to be big. GTD Pro field could double next year in full season entries, which would be huge. And then you consider like JDC and Proton. Both of those cars weren't at the Rolex this year. Those are two more cars that you're going to have to squeeze onto the grid. It's getting pretty packed. Yeah. It's getting pretty
in a different
packed.
Class.
Yeah, yeah, true. Oh yeah, you're right. They were. So I guess that's not a true two additional cars, but you look at it and it's getting pretty tight on there. Not to mention the growth of LMP2 that you're seeing as well. There's gonna be a good handful more teams that are expected to be full season entries there. And sure, you got rid of the 9 LMP3s that were on the grid this year, but you've already used up all of the space that you've made pretty much right there. So
right.
I think, like I said, if there's anybody that's going to be able to pull off getting a one-off entry into this race, it's going to be Roger Penske and
Yep.
getting another Porsche Penske 963 onto the grid. It's going to be him. And you know what? Even if they don't get that third entry, we're probably going to see Newgarden as one of the additional drivers for the Rolex, especially if they're giving him this at Petit Le Mans. It's probably going to be one of the fourth drivers or one of those add-on drivers for that. Very well might see McLaughlin in one of those roles as well.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there is the potential that they just replace the factory Porsche drivers, like we're seeing with Newgarden at Petit Le Mans. Maybe you get McLaughlin in the 6th car for next year's Rolex 24. I just have to wonder, because if you saw that third car at Le Mans, it just makes sense to me that you're going to get a lot of IndyCar interest if you run that third car. The big problem, I think, with sports car racing and the Rolex 24 is that you do get additional drivers in the field, but sometimes those drivers are in lower classes where they don't get as much of a spotlight. Now, I know that hasn't been true on a couple of occasions, because we've had, of course, Fernando Alonso had his couple-year stint at Wayne Taylor Racing, and then United Autosports, sorry. And then we had Chase Elliott in the Wheel and Engineering Cadillac. Was that 2021 or was that 2022?
Oh, it's a good question.
This is what because you're talking about COVID skewing my time perception.
Yeah.
There you go. Everything feels like a blur in that time frame. So yeah, we've seen that interest before. I just think that it would be something that they would have to strongly consider if they had the scenario for that. I got corrected, 2021 for that.
Yeah.
Okay. If nothing else, I want to move it on to the main story.
Yeah.
You know what? I've been trying to talk about balance of performance for a long time. I made a tweet, I believe, saying that I was going to talk about it when they changed the BoP right before Le Mans this year. And then I never did. I got sort of caught up in the excitement of Le Mans that I just didn't do that. So I'm going to sort of treat this first episode, burn all my my credibility if I have any at all.
Let's burn it all.
And just, nobody's going to like me after this. And I'm joking about that, because here's one comment I want to make. I noticed you had a reply on Twitter when we were promoting this episode from Andrew Kissinger, who is a mechanic on the number 24 BMW and IMSA. And he said, BOP is the only reason we have so many manufacturers. And that's absolutely correct, 100%. If you look at what happened to LMP1, especially with the hybrid manufacturers, it died off primarily due to some shoddy decision-making on VW's part, but mostly due to the fact that it costs so much money. I mean, you were talking about Formula One level budgets to run an LMP1 program. Now, that's great if you want to have a lot of technical innovation. You want to have the cutting-edge closed-wheel prototype race cars on the planet. It was fantastic for that. I love seeing different aero kits for the races. I love seeing all that development in the off-season. We basically had a brand new car in LMP1 every single year. If not a brand new car, it was sort of an evolution of the previous year's car. It was all extremely exciting, but it was also extremely expensive. So balance of performance was brought in for the top class prototypes in both series, or I guess both formulas, whether that be LMDH or Hypercar. Now, what I want to do here is I don't want to talk down on BOP, because like Andrew said, it's absolutely a necessity here. There's absolutely a reason for it. I do want to comment and just start sort of an open discussion on some of the decision making around BOP, and I think that there's some improvements that can be made, because while BOP is absolutely necessary, I do think that there are some flaws with it right now, and I think those flaws are only being amplified by the fact that you have top class prototypes now being affected by BOP for the first time in a world championship. I know IMSA has been using BOP for their prototypes for decade plus now, so this is nothing new for them. For a world championship like the FIA World Endurance Championship, this is kind of the first time it's been known as BOP. Of course, they had equivalents of technology before, which is kind of BOP under a blanket, just a little bit different. It was more focused on balancing the non-hybrid cars versus the hybrid cars. And back when Audi was in the series, the petrol cars versus the diesel cars. So here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about BOP primarily in prototype racing. And I'll tell you why primarily prototypes. I think, as I was talking to you about this the other day, I think there's a lot more of a case for BOP and GT racing, because you're talking about a ton of different classes of cars. You have front engine cars, you have rear engine cars, you have cars that are based on sedans like the Lexus RCF. You have cars that are based on top of the line supercars like Lamborghini Huracans. Those two cars are not going to be the same level of performance. They're not going to be in the same league of performance on their own. You sort of need to have some system in place there to keep everything in check. With prototype racing, it's a bit different, because you are building a car to a stricter set of regulations. You're building, they'll give you the targets. This is what the minimum weight is. This is what the power output should be. You're a lot more restricted in the design of the car, with the exception of Nissan and LMP1. Everybody's running a mid-engine rear-wheel drive formula or four-wheel drive in the case of some of the hybrids in WEC. Everything is a lot more built to be, a purpose-built race car versus GT racing where you're sort of adapting that road car into a race car. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you want to hazard a guess at what the most, in my mind, pure prototype or top-level prototype race in the last decade was? In IMSA, at least.
Oh, man. I have no idea.
I'll give you a hint. You don't have to look that far back.
The most pure.
In terms of BoP fairness, if you want to talk about how unintrusive BoP was.
Oh, man. Well, I would think honestly, I would probably think this year.
Yep.
No, I'm in the right ballpark there.
Yeah. So I'll just tell you, this year's Rolex 24, every single car in GTP weighed the exact same. It had the exact same power output, and they had some differences with maximum RPM and some of the other things that IMSA focuses on for BoP, but the base things right there, the weight and the power, were the exact same across all the cars. Of course, they didn't have anything to really base that BoP off of, unless you wanted to base it off testing. Now, basing balance of performance tables off testing alone is kind of a risky game, so I can see why IMSA didn't want to do that this year. But long story short, if you look at this year's Rolex 24, every single car in GTP, same weight, same power output,
and it reflected in the quality of the performance over the weekend. You saw, Porsche, they very well could have snagged pole. They were quick. They got bit in the race a little bit by some reliability stuff. Cadillac, led a portion of the race. They looked quick. Acura, of course, they looked quick as well. BMW was at the Rolex. They were a little bit behind on testing, so reliability was much more of a focus for them. But we've seen how they've come on in the remainder of the season. But when you consider the 3 of the 4 manufacturers were there at some point over the course of the Rolex weekend, you're right. That's a really good point. It was very close, and the BoP was not all over the place either. The BoP was very close between them as well.
Right, and so that's sort of my point. Is you had 3 of the 4 manufacturers, exception being BMW, led the race at some point. And I think all 3 of those manufacturers had a chance at the win. So that sort of raises the question of how much work does BoP need to do here? You already have the cars pretty close. So what should you be doing from a balance of performance standpoint to really just dial those cars in, make sure that they're in the exact same performance window without starting some massive spending war? Because don't get me wrong, if you had no BoP and you left those cars at that, BMW was on the backhand a little bit there. They would have had to spend a lot of money developing additional aero for the car, trying to make up that deficit. Even though it was probably only about a second and a half over a lap, that's still quite a bit in racing terms. So what BoP is doing is it's saying, don't worry, we're going to give you a little bump up here. We're going to make sure that you don't have to go out and spend millions of dollars developing and doing R&D for additional parts to your car. I think that's fair. So let's just start here. I'm going to go over how IMSA and the World Endurance Championship measure their balance of performance, what boundaries they set to regulate it, because they are a bit different, and that's one of the points I want to make here, is that the 2 series actually have kind of a different philosophy for how they do balance of performance. So for IMSA, again, I'm going to focus on GTP, but the mass of the car is set, the base of it is 1,030 kilograms. Now that's excluding the driver and fuel. You have that minimum weight. And then you have the maximum engine RPM. So I believe the Acura is set highest traditionally. That's all based on what engine configuration you're running. Obviously, when Mazda was running with their turbo 4-cylinder in the DPI era, that thing revved really high because it's a really small engine and it's turbocharged and it needs to get up to higher RPM than, say, like a Cadillac naturally aspirated V8. You have the maximum power output, which is measured in kilowatts, and that's combined from the internal combustion engine and the hybrid system. You have, and also you can probably tell I'm reading notes off this. There's no way I was going to memorize all
Oh,
this.
you're not just pulling
No,
this out of
I don't
memory?
just have this all in the noggin. You have the stint energy replenishment rate, which is measured in megajoules per second. Now, I could do an episode talking about the sports car racing alphabet soup, because you talked earlier about how sports car racing can be quite confusing at times, and that's another point I've always wanted to make, is just how many terms there are for sports car racing that other series don't really seem to deal with. But anyway, that maximum stint energy replenishment rate. What this is you have a quote unquote virtual energy tank. Now how that works is when the car is in the pit box, the fueler will plug the fuel into the car. When they do that, there's a sensor on the fueler that actually determines that it's connected to the car, and it will replenish that virtual energy tank. Now you can actually, there's a cool graphic for this in the World Endurance Championship that actually, if they're pitting, they'll show the virtual energy tank and you'll see it going up.
Yep.
IMSA hasn't debuted anything like that to my knowledge so far.
Nope.
But it's the same exact type of system.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because the WEC does that graphic is amazing. And that alone, we talked about how confusing it was. That just makes it so much easier for a fan that's dipping in, maybe from F1. F1 used to have a graphic like that when they had an energy, I think the KERS system, it might have been.
Right. Yep.
But anyways, those graphics, IMSA needs a graphic like that, because they have the information, and
Yep.
the WEC does a great job of it. Sorry, I had to throw that in.
No, I fully agree with you on that. So those are the parameters for the GTP cars. For the GTP cars. For the GT cars, there you go again. There's additional things in there, like they have mandated fuel tank sizes, mandated wing configurations, etc. But for the sake of focusing primarily on the prototypes, there you go. And IMSA has a new BoP bulletin published before every race. For the World Endurance Championship, for Hypercar, you have BoP based on these parameters. Again, it's mostly similar. You have the mass of the car that they're dictating. You have the maximum power output measured in kilowatts. Again, same as IMSA, combined of the combustion engine and the hybrid system, if they have a hybrid, because some of the WEC Hypercars do not have a hybrid system. You have the minimum hybrid energy deployment speed measured in kilometers per hour.
Oh, boy.
What that is that's because WEC Hypercars, the ones that are hybrid powered right now at least, deploy that hybrid to the front wheels. So IMSA GTP cars deploy that hybrid energy to the rear wheels. It's actually not as much hybrid power as they have in the WEC. I think it's only about 40, 50 horsepower from those GTP motors. Basically, that's just to prevent the hybrid-powered cars in the World Endurance Championship, or the hypercars, the front-wheel drive hybrid hypercars, from getting a giant advantage out of the corners that they were getting in the LMP1 days. And that's one of the reasons why, if you go back and watch like a 2019, 2020 WEC race, in sort of the dying eras of LMP1, you would have cars like the Rebellion or the BR1 just as fast, if not faster, on a single lap time. But when it came to the race itself, Toyota was just dominating because they had that hybrid energy, that four-wheel drive out of the corners. And especially in the rain, that is extremely helpful to have that four-wheel drive out of the corners. But it's useful for tire wear because you're having four wheels help you out of the corner instead of two. So what the WEC has done to try to prevent that is now they have a minimum speed where you can deploy that energy. For the the Toyota and the Ferrari, it is 190 kilometers per hour, and then the Peugeot is 135 now. It used to be 150, now it's 135 kilometers per hour when it's dry out. And that only applies to the four-wheel drive hypercars, not the rear-wheel drive only LMDH cars in the WEC. We're not done yet. We have the same maximum stint energy as IMSA. And then instead of the stint energy replenishment rate that they have in IMSA, the hybrid cars have an additional mandated fuel docking time. So if you're done fueling the car, you have to leave the fueler docked for another second, 1.2 seconds, whatever is mandated by the BoP. The one of the differences from IMSA is that the BOP is set in 3 race increments ahead of time. At least it has been so far this season. So we had the season starting BOP for Sebring, and then they did Portimao, Spa, and Le Mans. It kind of changed Le Mans at the last minute, which was a bit of a that I want to discuss in a little bit. And then they did Monza, Fuji, I guess they did 4 races after, because I think they set the BOP through the end of the season. So it was Monza, Fuji, and Bahrain. Never mind. I'm not missing any races. That's 3 races. Cool. And then, like I had mentioned, they have equivalence of technology still that they can update every 2 races, and that's between the GTP Formula cars and the Hypercar Formula car, or the LMDH Formula cars versus the Hypercar Formula cars. Again, kind of confusing, but basically the gist of it is, look, the GTP cars are a little bit different. They have the rear-wheel drive hybrid energy, so we want to have a bit of a barrier in there if we have to make those cars faster. In essence, what they'll do is, if the Hypercar Formula cars have a clear advantage in the Hypercar class, then the LMDH Formula cars will get a little bit of a bump up, and then that'll apply to all of the cars. So if they decide LMDH needs a bit of a kick, they'll give the Porsche 5 horsepower, they'll give the Cadillac 5 horsepower, so on and so forth.
Oh man,
I think that covers the prototypes.
That's a long list.
For GTE in the WEC, again, same sort of idea. They have mandated tank sizes, and they also have the success ballast. I'm not going to talk about the success ballast because I don't want to get myself in a lot of trouble. But my opinions of it are not too positive, even in an AM class, because they didn't have it in Pro, but they do have it in the AM class, and I just don't want to talk about it. And that BOP is published before every race for the GTE cars. So that's a lot of talking on my front. I'm curious if you have anything to throw onto that before I go on to my sort of next idea here.
Man, there was a lot that you covered there. I think the real takeaway from this for me, when BOP is so complicated, and it's no wonder that there is a large team of very smart individuals that are working with a lot of data to try and put this together. And you think about everything that we just talked about. It's important to remember that, again, it's extremely complicated, and sometimes the BOP, it's very difficult to make the BOP perfect. You might even say it's impossible to make the BOP perfect. And you look back on all of the list of things that you just mentioned, and it's easy to see why. Trying to balance all of these variables to, if you make a car lighter, then how's that going to affect other parts of it? And I think the WEC, IMSA, all the sporting bodies that go in and do BOP, I think they catch a lot of flack for it sometimes. I think it's important to recognize some of the good work that they do as well, and in making, and oftentimes, many times they do produce a good BOP, but as we all know, there are other times where they don't produce such a good BOP.
Definitely. And I think that's a good point. The majority of the time, it's a fantastic addition to the series. Okay, these cars are extremely competitive. You're talking about cars that are fundamentally very different, and the fact that I'll tell you one story. When I was about 4 hours left in Le Mans this year, I was sitting on the entrance to Tête Rouge, and I watched the Ferrari go by, the 51 Ferrari, and then I turned my head back over to the left. 2 seconds later, the number 8 Toyota is coming by. You know how long it's been since we've had a lead battle like that at Le Mans with 4 hours to go. I mean, I thought I was still sleeping. I thought I was still dreaming when that was happening. There's a huge positive to having that system. Now, the negative is that it's not always perfect. And there have been some occasions where it's been particularly controversial. And the problem with that is that now you have the performance windows of the car being determined by an external body, not by the manufacturers, but by a board of people, and sometimes it's being assisted by software, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, that are determining how fast the car can go. And I think that was brought to light during Le Mans this year when, by all means, Toyota had the best car. I think that it's safe to say Toyota had the best shot at winning. They didn't have the fastest car though, and it's because they had that weight increase right before the race. I think that certainly hurt them. Now, was that weight increase significant enough to cost them the victory? I don't know. I'm not, I can't tell you for sure. Of course, the 51 Ferrari didn't have a perfect race either, but it's certainly something that gets blamed. If your favorite manufacturer, your favorite team has a tough race, it's easy to point at it and be like, well, you know what? They had a bad BOP. This wasn't the team's fault. They had a bad BOP. They couldn't even have a chance at competing. And unfortunately, we saw this sort of story with the GT3 Porsche teams, the GTD Porsche teams at the Rolex 24 this year. FAF Motorsports, by all means, is perhaps the strongest GTD Pro team in IMSA right now. And I know they got a podium at this year's Rolex 24, but during the race, they were absolutely nowhere on pace. And after the race, people weren't talking about, how FAF Motorsports, could have built a better car. They were talking about how FAF Motorsports had a poor BOP, which, frankly, I think was the truth for this year.
Yes.
But it sort of adds that element of separation where you don't really know where to point the finger anymore. And it's very, very easy to say, nope, it's not my favorite driver's fault, not my favorite team's fault. It's BOP's fault.
Yeah. Yeah. You see it all the time. And drivers have good tracks and bad tracks as well. Cars have tracks that they're better suited to or not as suited to as well. And this goes back to before BOP or before any sort of BOP was introduced. Like these are variables as well. And people, you need to remember that your favorite driver, your favorite team, your favorite team's car that they run, they might not have the straight line speed out of the box like other cars do. And that's regardless of BOP. They might be counting on BOP to try and make that closer. But in theory, the manufacturer, they should be able to make up for that at other tracks. It was tough to see the Rolex was tough for a lot of teams. It wasn't just Porsche. You had Lamborghini, you had Ferrari. Coincidentally, a lot of the new cars that were brought in, you saw it with BMW the year before as well. We're probably going to see it with Corvette and Ford next year, which hopefully we don't, knock on wood. But it's always difficult to see, is it the driver? Is it the team? Is it the BOP? What's truly going on, when in reality, there's a good chance it's a combination of all three.
Right. And that's a good example. Because did the teams this year who brought a new car, maybe they just didn't know exactly how to extract all the performance out of it yet. Yeah. Maybe there was something the manufacturer was missing. Or maybe it was all down to BOP. It's really just tough to make that assumption, though. It's not like Formula One where you're building a new car every year. Everybody has their own performance standard. With Formula One, you can point at it and say, oh, look, McLaren really improved this season. They really found a lot of pace they didn't have at the beginning of the season. Of course, Formula One costs $200 million a season. We're not going to do that with FAF Motorsports and and Turner Motorsports. But it's just a tricky situation. And I'll talk about a comment here we got from Andrew Reeves. We said BOP kind of soured Le Mans for me. Had Ford GT vibes when the Ferrari returned. Now that's reference to 2016. I think the statute of limitations is kind of passed on this, where I can talk a little bit more freely about it.
Yeah.
with the 24 Hours of Le Mans. If you're out of the know, there were some allegations being thrown around that Ford was sandbagging in the Le Mans test and the prior races leading up to Le Mans, so that they would have a much favorable balance of performance update for the race, and therefore would be able to sort of walk away with an easy win on the 50th anniversary of their first. That brings up an entirely second issue, which is the issue of sandbagging. There's been steps put in place to try to combat that. I know this year with the World Endurance Championship, they set the BOP for the first three races. They said, or not the first three, again, they did Sebring first, and then they set Portimao, Spa, and Le Mans. the idea behind that is, all right, well, Le Mans already set in place before we even run the second race of this season. All right, so don't even try sandbagging. It's not going to work. We already set the BoP here. The problem with that is that they went back on their word on that. And I think that sets a bit of a tough precedent for the future seasons, because if you have a standard of, we're going to set the BoP 3 races in advance, that way you can't try to cheat the system by sandbagging in these other races. If you go back on your word with that, then what precedent does that set for next year, that you aren't going to do the exact same thing? I think that the WEC was in a very tough position this year. They coincidentally got a ton of new manufacturers on the 100th anniversary of their premier race. So obviously there's a ton of interest to win. Of course, there's a ton of interest to win Le Mans in general, but there's even more interest to win the 100th anniversary running of Le Mans. So in the back of their heads from the start, they said, well, we have to do everything we can to make sure these teams aren't going to be able to exploit the system, or else we might see a repeat of what happened in 2016. I will raise my hand and say that Le Mans would not have been as interesting this year if they didn't do that last minute update. I think Toyota probably, assuming they didn't have any issues, probably would have walked away with the win on that one. I don't know how far the gap would have been, but I don't know if we would have seen those sort of on-track battles that we were seeing for the lead had that been the case, or had they not made that change. At the same time, I don't really like the fact that they did make the change, because I think that that's, like I said, it's just setting a tough precedence for the future. And there's got to be some element in play to combat sandbagging. They've tried everything before. We've seen very strict penalties if you're accused of sandbagging. I think that happened with a Lamborghini team at the Rolex 24 a handful of years back.
2016, yep. I think they got disqualified.
Did they get disqualified? I can't remember if it was disqualified or like a 5-minute stop and hold penalty during the race or something like that.
I think that was it. Yeah, I think
it's been a long time.
Big stop and hold, yeah.
So I just think that there's it's a necessary evil. Can I just say that BoP is really a necessary evil? Because we've already established that it's necessary, but we've also established that there's some faults to it. Now I want to talk about the difference in philosophy between both series. IMSA's philosophy, the impression that I've gotten, is that IMSA is trying to balance the cars so that their performance is as similar as possible over a lap, or over a stint if you want to get more precise with it. Because again, one lap performance doesn't really mean anything in sports car racing. So let's try to keep them as balanced as possible over a stint. And then the manufacturers have everything in their power to determine how reliable the car is, how well the car holds up for multiple stints, etc. The WEC philosophy that I've sort of gathered, but also the commentators have made note of, is that they want to balance the potential performance of those cars to be as similar as possible over a lap. Now, that becomes clear when you look at the performance that we've seen out of Glickenhaus and Van Wall and the 9X8 this year as well. All 3 of those cars, now of course Peugeot's been improving recently, and they've found themselves in the lead for quite a long time at Le Mans, especially in the wet conditions. But the system is simple. We're going to help you to a certain extent. If you look at the Glickenhaus, they've consistently had the lightest car in the field, in the class at least, and they've also had the most powerful car in the class on most occasion. So it's sort of up to them at that point to say, look, we sort of want to adapt our car a little bit better. Maybe we want to come out with an Evo kit for the car so that it unlocks a little bit more performance. At the end of the day, here's the real story. Porsche has been doing over 10,000 kilometers of test miles with their 963. How many miles of testing has Glickenhaus done in the last year? And I'm not going to fault Glickenhaus. I think that they're a phenomenal small team, and I love to see small teams on the grid like that. And they're working well within the confines of their budget. But it does sort of highlight this idea of, look, if you want to unlock all that performance from your car, you're still going to have to go out and you're going to have to do the work for it. You're still going to have to test. You're still going to have to, look at some of the limitations in your car and maybe put steps to try to improve them. That's a little interesting because I feel like how far do you go with that before you start unlocking a spending war again?
Yeah, it's such a fine line to walk. Because I mean, you mentioned it earlier that the downfall of LMP1 was, the spending war that teams and manufacturers were getting into, and BoP is meant to counter that, right? It's yeah, it's a very fine line that you have to walk.
Yep. And I think the assumption with this year, under that philosophy, again, we're trying to balance the potential performance of the cars over a lap. Obviously, under that definition, Toyota is going to have the advantage at most, if not all, of the races because they have setups from previous seasons. They have a lot more data from their car than Cadillac, Porsche, or any of these manufacturers do, except maybe Click. Well, yeah, they've run even more races than Clickenhouse because Clickenhouse hasn't been doing full seasons. And Toyota's been running 2 cars as well. So they have a lot more data. They have prior setups for all these tracks. So should they be rewarded with the fact that they've been in the series longer and they have more experience? I think you could make an argument to both sides. I think that it's certainly fair enough to say, look, yeah, they've done their homework. They've done a lot of miles on their car already. They've raced that car since 2021. Why not? Why shouldn't they be allowed to have a bit of an advantage? I think it would be a little bit concerning for them if they entered Sebring this year and they were on the back foot and all these other manufacturers that just started had significantly more pace than them. Because at that point, from a Toyota standpoint, it's like, well, what did we do all that development for, and what did we run all these previous seasons for if they're just going to have the exact same performance as us right out of the gate? So I like both systems. All right, I think that there's pros and cons to both systems. One of the things I do like about the WEC philosophy of it, if they stick to it, and that's sort of my concern about when they changed the BoP before Le Mans. What grounds were you changing the BoP before Le Mans on? Is that the cars weren't close enough at tracks like Spa? Because what we saw all week at Le Mans in the race qualifying is that Ferrari did have a bit of a pace advantage. And it's been pretty much the only time this season that they've had a distinct pace advantage during the race. Of course, they got pole at Monza. But not at Monza, I'm sorry, at Sebring. But, for race conditions, that was the only race where another team besides Toyota really had the upper hand. I don't want to get too off topic with that, though. Back to my point of what was I talking about?
Well, just the WEC BOP and trying to the WEC philosophy where they're trying to balance the potential performance
right
overlap.
Yeah, so that's where we saw that a bit of a divergent from that for Le Mans this year. But I think the rest of the season they've sort of operated under that philosophy, and we've seen manufacturers like Cadillac and Porsche been able to make up some pace throughout the season. Some of it
as they should be, right? More miles on the car, better knowledge of the car. They should be starting to catch up. Yeah.
Right. You have more data on the car now. It's a lot easier to make setups now that you have, of course, they're still going into Fuji this weekend with 0 miles run at Fuji. Toyota has 2 years that they've already run at Fuji with that car, ignoring the fact that they have like 10 years of prior experience from running LMP1. I don't know how much that data translates over to Hypercar, but point still stands. I think we're going to see an improvement, especially next year, with the gap in performance between Toyota and Ferrari and Porsche and Cadillac and Peugeot. I don't know if manufacturers like Lamborghini and Alpine are going to come out of the gate kicking the same way because, again, they're approaching with a brand new car, no race miles on it, and they're going to have to go through the same process. And I think that if they stick with the same philosophy, I think that's a fair system. You just have to stick with it. That's the point I'm trying to make, is you can't just backpedal on that decision at the biggest race of your series' existence to make the race closer, because you're going to upset a lot of manufacturers doing that, as we saw from Toyota this year. And the thing about BoP is that it's not BoP that manufacturers are against, because all the manufacturers agreed to it. And like Andrew said earlier, that's the only reason most of the manufacturers are there. What manufacturers don't want to see is you backpedaling on how you want to handle BOP, or especially if you have a poor method of determining the BOP. That's going to begin to shine some alarm bells on the series. And I think that that's what the manufacturers are going to look at and say, is this really where we want to be spending our money?
Yeah. Yeah. You do have to, you're very right. You got to be careful with making sure that you stick to your word, because Toyota probably isn't going to be one of the teams that would stick their hands up and make a big stink about it.
Right.
But it's very, very obvious that, and very rightfully so, they were frustrated with those changes before Le Mans. And I mean, you put it all perfectly. When there is a change that you are not expecting before the biggest race of the season, um, that is a tough pill to swallow, especially when it comes as at a pretty big disadvantage to the car that you're operating.
Right.
That's
Yep.
And yeah, it's always interesting for me to contrast how the WEC works with this versus IMSA. I think it might have been last year where IMSA released a BOP update at Sebring like the Friday before. It's like 2 days before the race, and it was to try and bring Corvette up into the mix a little bit more. And that's IMSA. I don't think it was the first time that they've done that. It's probably not going to be the last, but that's also IMSA operates on a race by race basis. They don't say, here's your 3-race BOP. And then as you said, going into the 24 Hours of Le Mans, that would be pretty unexpected to have a change. So yeah, hopefully all you can hope for at the end of the day is that the WEC and the governing body is going to learn from that, and they're going to make improvements so that it doesn't happen again in the future. There's not really anything that you can do to affect to change what happened anymore. You just got to hope that they learn from it, and they stick to their word to the T, or bring in regulations so that teams are aware that changes could happen.
And you want to know the good thing about it is that BOP is sort of one of the things that most casual fans who tune in to a big race like Daytona or Le Mans don't usually pick up on.
Yep.
So hopefully I'm not bringing a lot of limelight to this, the situation. It's something that a lot of the more passionate fans definitely bicker and argue about, but the headline will say who won the race. It's not going to usually get into the politics of how they won the race. So for most people, they're not actually going to know or be aware of all the things that are going on behind the scenes, which I think is good, because I think that there is a very ugly political side to sports car racing, more so than you might see in some other series. And I think that really only does damage to the sport. And any way that you can try to cover that behind the scenes. Again, I'm not doing a good job by making an entire episode dedicated to it, but I think that if they can sort of brush those things behind the scenes to the common public, then that's kind of in their advantage.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did see.
No, go ahead.
Yep. I was going to say, I did see some comments that I want to read through while we're still on the topic of balance of performance. Andrew Reef said it's going to be tougher to manage everything next year in Hypercar or with everything new next year in Hypercar and GT. So many new cars coming. That's absolutely right. I mean, not only do we have additional Hypercars next year coming with the addition of Lamborghini and Alpine and Asada Fraschini if they do show up. We also have the GT3 class, which is an entirely new thing for the World Endurance Championship.
True.
You have additional variables at play there. So they'll, I think, definitely take everything that they're learning from this year's process, and they'll try to refine it, and they'll try to make sure that everything is as streamlined as it can be for next season. And I think that this is something that really, realistically, they're only going to improve on. But you're right; it's definitely harder when you have additional pieces to the puzzle.
There was a comment made further up too that the WEC, they were trying to balance, multiple prototypes, multiple. You had Hypercar, and then you had the LMDH cars that you're trying to create a BOP for as well. There'd be a huge learning curve. They're for the most part pretty different. And trying to learn how all of those, how everything, all the variables interact with one another would be such an incredible learning curve. I can only imagine.
Right. And not only are the cars wildly different, they're wildly complicated too. I
Yeah.
mean, you're talking about, like I said, we've had some cars in hypercar that are four-wheel drive out of the corners. We have some that are only rear-wheel drive. We have non-hybrids. We have hybrids. When you're talking about GT cars, you might be balancing additional platforms like front engine, mid-engine, rear engine, etc. But in general, the cars are fundamentally more similar. So there's a lot less variables to worry about when you're trying to perfect that balance of performance. With the prototypes, like you said, you're right. There's a lot more that they actually have to worry about. And I'll give them kudos. I think that the majority of the races we've seen this year have been pretty fair and they've played out pretty well. And I think that nobody has won a race this year that they didn't deserve. Okay, you can talk all you want about the BoP change before Le Mans this year, but Ferrari absolutely deserved that, to win the race. They put a lot of testing into that car. They had zero reliability issues with that car, which came as a bit of a surprise to me, honestly. They did their homework. And so, if they're going to win on those standards, then I'm fine with that. Now, let's see. We had a couple other things here. Want to see Toyota to be dominant again for the next few years. Come on, we need to have more various teams enthusiasts in the sport. I agree with that. And, I think that that's one of the things at play that comes with BoP. You're right that there's a lot of people that were sick and tired of seeing Toyota walk away with every single race. I agree with that. From a manufacturer standpoint, I do think you have to sympathize with the manufacturers a little bit and say, look, Toyota, while they have been dominant, yes, they also have, as part of being dominant, they have a ton of data. So there's reason for them to have a bit of a performance advantage over some of the other cars. Now, that's not to say that performance advantage should last forever. I think that, especially towards the last two races of the season with Fuji this weekend, and then we have Bahrain as the season finale, I would love to see some more cars in the fight. I would love to see Cadillac and Porsche really fighting for the lead and sort of sticking it to Ferrari and Toyota as well. I just don't know if you're going to see that right away under their current philosophy. I think that is going to take a little bit of time, wait for the cars, the other manufacturers to get their data, and wait for them to get some more miles on the car for them to really push it to Toyota standard. Let's see. Go ahead.
You can't argue though that having a Ferrari win such a big race like this was a nice headline for the WEC to have.
No doubt. Yeah, of course it was. And that's what fans of the track wanted to see. All right, let's paint it as it is. All right, people at the track wanted to see a Ferrari win. It was an extremely popular win at the track. The crowd reaction was phenomenal to that. You can talk all you want about the politics behind the scenes of it, but like you said, it was a popular win.
That was a win for sports car racing in general.
Right, of course.
Ferrari won that race.
I like to sort of gauge sports car racing popularity sometimes by doing the Gen Z thing and looking at impressions on social media. And if you look at how many likes the WEC and the Le Mans Instagram account got out of that race weekend, I mean, we're talking like 150,000, 200,000 likes for the Toyota win, or for the Ferrari win, sorry. Some of the battle clips when they were battling with 4 hours to go in the race for the lead, 100,000 likes. I mean, of course it was a win for the series and a win for sports car racing in general. Let's see. I'm trying to see if there's anything else. It certainly is a huge risk to set off sandbagging in all of the pre-Le Mans races of the season. 100% agree with that. That's one of the issues that IMSA doesn't really have to deal with. The flip side with IMSA is they don't really get as much data to work with. So IMSA they have their Daytona tests, and then they basically balance their performance off that sometimes. But in the case of this year, they just sort of said, look, we're going to set a baseline. All the manufacturers will run at that, and we'll leave it there for now. But like you said, yeah, it's tricky when you have the fourth race of your season be the flagship when you have balance of performance, because it can be exploited. It has been exploited. and it's tricky to put a stop to that. I think that it's a challenge that they'll consistently have to deal with for sure. And I think after the precedent that was set this year, this is why I said it's a little bit dangerous to play with that, because it makes me a little bit pessimistic about what the scenario could look like next year. But we'll see. Maybe I'm being overly pessimistic about that, but it's just something that I'm wondering. All right. The last thing I want to talk about, on the topic of balanced performance, I've been going on about it for probably about 40 minutes now. I do want to talk about sort of how the WEC at least is trying to make it a little bit more fair. Because there's been different methods in the past to balancing the cars. In LMP1 with the final season, 2019 into 2020, we had a success balance in LMP1. I'm especially not going to talk about that because I'm just not. I'm not going to talk about a success balance in the top level of a world prototype championship. I'm not going to do it. Poor idea, to say the least. We've had iterations of automatic BoP in the past where you have computer generated models that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Now, I think that there's advantages to that, because what you're removing a lot of when you have the computerized aspect of it is you're removing a lot of that human element. Which that's
more
not
opportunity for error, right?
Right. You know, when you have the human element of balancing the cars, I feel like that decision gets sort of weighted a little bit heavier, because then, you know, you have a board of people that are determining the balance of performance for the race. If you have a computer assisted or a computer generated model for the BoP, it's working with significantly more data. It knows, you know, they're tracking a ton of data on these cars. They're tracking power output and tire wear and tire pressure, you know, let's not talk about that. And everything. Obviously not tire pressures well enough. Huh?
Yeah.
You know, so they're trained on a lot of data. And so that's certainly going to be an advantage when you're trying to come up with a fair balance between all of the classes. What the WEC is working with right now is a partially automated process. They use software called AVL, which, again, this is sort of a program where you plug a lot of data into software. And DTM has actually used this in the past for setting balance of performance in their series. I do think that that's a positive step for these series to take, because if you're going to be mandating performance targets for each car, if you're going to be setting the performance limits for each car, you need to make sure that you're doing it in a way that is as accurate as possible and as consistent as possible as well. One of the things that I had a complaint with in the past, and I don't know if you've picked up on this, but there were some days in IMSA and the WEC, I guess we can say, where when you have BoP influencing class results, it's sort of a, you know, pick your card for who wins that race or who has the performance advantage that weekend. There's a lot less consistency. And the one thing I will comment about with the WEC this year is that the BoP in the top class, at least, has been very consistent. All right. It's usually been Toyota versus Ferrari. The other manufacturers are slowly creeping up. Unfortunately, due to their lack of testing, you have the Glickenhaus and the Van Wall in the back of the field. But again, you know, they're privateers. They have a lot less testing miles. There's only so much they can really extract from their cars. I get it. I am glad, though, that we're seeing a level of consistency out of the performance. And I'm curious if you've seen cases in the past, if you know what I'm talking about, where it's sort of a pick your card, and we'll see who has the most performance out of this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of, off the top of my head, I can't think of a time where there was a horrendously bad BoP in the top flight of prototypes. But I mean, we're also looking with the most recent era, in the DPI era. You know, they had a pretty good idea of what those cars were doing. They ran those for a number of years.
Right.
This year, I think it's been, you mentioned that we talked about the Rolex 24 and how that was pretty darn close earlier this year. I think it's been, for the most part, pretty close as the season has gone on. There's been a few misses here and there, but you see teams are getting better over the course of the season. BMW has picked up a ton of speed in doing that. They, through a couple of races in the more towards the beginning of the summer, you were looking at them as probably favorites or potentially the quickest car in those races. You've had instances where you've had instances where all of them have been quick, and not just in individual races as well. Over multiple race spans, you've seen cars come and go over the course of races as conditions have become more favorable, perhaps towards one. Maybe they're a little bit cooler, maybe they're a little bit warmer. If tire preservation becomes more of a sticking point as well. So, I think if I had to sum up BoP for IMSA this season, I don't know. I've been pretty impressed by it. Yeah.
I haven't had a problem with balance of performance this season. I mean, there was GTD at Daytona, which we did mention, but
I do GTD's remember been a bit of a different story, but GTP has been pretty good.
Right. Further back, there were some instances. I mean, I'm talking, probably around 8 years ago now, where there were some GT races where a car would be extremely slow one week and then too quick the next weekend. And I am glad that we're starting to see that less and less, because that just makes the series harder to follow, first of all.
Yes.
When you have a manufacturer who's bottom of the barrel at like Laguna Seca, and then they go to the next race and then they're on pole by half a second. It's like, well, where did that pace come from? And then IMSA's going to realize, oh, we overcompensated a little bit. We'll take a little bit away from them. And then, the next race, they're maybe down in third or fourth. I think that just adds an element of confusion. I'm glad that we're sort of shying away from that, especially with how BoP is starting to get a little bit more automated. And as I said before, this is, I think, an ever-improving process where, especially as more and more people become aware of it, they're becoming more and more vocal about it. So I think that there is added pressure for these series to really 100%. Get their act together and make sure everything is in check. And I do think that process is going to improve more in the future.
And I think a really big part of this is, there's no doubt that there's been a huge influx of fans into racing in general, especially in North America, since Drive to Survive became a thing. And when your first introduction to racing is Formula One, a non-BoP series, it's very easy to become interested in sports car racing and go, why on earth are they trying to slow down my favorite Acura and try and bring the Cadillac up to be the same level as it? Like, it should just be faster. Oh, Acura lost the race. Well, yeah, they have a better car, but they were brought back. That's not fair. But it's very easy to see from and be vocal about that, see it from that perspective. When there is a huge influx of fans that, as you mentioned, it's not something that all fans know about to begin with. Even if you have to be pretty diehard and pretty into sports car racing to know a lot about the BoP and then how that impacts everything from week to week. But you're right. There has been more people that are more vocal about it in recent years, and that could be a big factor playing in that as well.
Yep. All right. I think I'm done making enemies with these two series. I hope I didn't piss away any chance I had at working with them in the future. But we'll leave that for another time. All right. That's all I really wanted to cover about BoP. We're going to move on a little bit here. Before I go to my last topic, which is a bit of a WEC preview for Fuji this weekend, I do just want to hit on a couple comments here. Dispatch office, what drivers will sit in IMSA and the Lamborghini LMDH in 2024? Romain Grosjean, Danica Fiat. To be honest, I don't know. I wish I had an answer for you on that. I'm not much of an IMSA insider. I don't know if you have anything on that, Stu. But what I do know is that with that car, it has been not officially announced, but at least heavily implied that car will not be making a debut at the Rolex 24, unfortunately. might be pushed back to the 12 hours of Sebring on the IMSA side.
Yeah, that is definitely a big bummer. I think they've pretty much all but confirmed it's not going to be at the Rolex. Unfortunately, I think it would probably take a bit of a miracle for it. It just sounds like they not going to have the testing that they want to feel ready. As for drivers, I mean, I don't have any inside information by any stretch of the imagination, but if I had to bet, I would think that Grosjean would be sort of the headline driver of that crew. They've had him in IMSA this year. He's been in North America for a few years now, racing in IndyCar. It's going to be interesting to see if he's racing in IndyCar next year, but that's a whole other can of worms. If I had to bet, I would think that Grosjean would be one of the IMSA drivers, and then I think that Kvyat would probably lean towards more of a WEC ride.
Right. And that's the difficulty part for me, is trying to discern which program they would go to. I agree with you on Grosjean, because I was actually talking about this the other day, because he's, I think, officially confirmed out of his seat for Andretti next year. So he's now looking for an IndyCar ride. Maybe. Is he? That's my question. Is he looking for another IndyCar seat, or is he just going to go Lamborghini full-time sports car racing in the top class now?
It's a good question.
It's what I'm waiting on.
I mean, if he goes full-time racing and he is the IMSA driver, he's only going to be in 4 races next year, theoretically, because the 4 of the 5 Endurance Cup races, I don't know, maybe they slot him into a GT ride every now and then, but yeah, that would be a big reel in of schedule for Grosjean, going from, a pretty intense IndyCar schedule and, Formula One before that just keeps getting more intense every year, to a 4-race season. And probably he's going to be at Le Mans. I think.
Yeah, I think that would be certainly his goal. Right. And then we're getting a few comments from Kyle. And I do want to talk about Kyle, because I remembered it. I forgot to talk about Kyle at the beginning of this episode. Obviously, I got this guy now on the podcast, and I don't have Kyle beside me. And there's no bad blood there. I raced Kyle and iRacing like 2 nights ago. I'll probably do that right after this episode's over. Kyle's just been a little busy. He's actually a frequent, or on every episode basically, except for one so far, of David Land's podcast. You can go check him out on there. No bad blood, though. He's just pretty busy with his current life situation of where he works. And it seemed like, for the format of this show, being more sports car focused entirely, it would be great to pull somebody else on. But I would like to have Kyle on some episodes in the future, because obviously still brings some great insight, and there's no beef there. Anyway, Kyle asked, speaking of tire pressure.
We wanted all the beef.
Yeah, well, you're not... Maybe between me and IMSA at this point, but after that BoP discussion, maybe there's some beef. But hopefully the Dunans are actually all right with me.
At your door.
I hope not. So Kyle asked, speaking of tire pressure, is it pretty much a formality that Shank doesn't return to HPD next season in IMSA, with WTR moving to 2 cars? If so, where do they go? I'm going to let you talk on that one first. I'm going to throw you on the spot.
Yeah, it's... I mean, obviously nothing is confirmed yet. It's just all speculation, but it looks like the writing is on the wall, and it looks like the writing is spelling out that Meyer-Shank Racing won't be an Acura team next year. Whether it has to do anything with the Rolex 24, or whether, how could you not want to have a 2, if Wayne Taylor Racing with Andretti wants to have a 2-car outfit, you're letting them do that every day of the week. They're such a strong organization. They only got stronger with Andretti, and they're only going to be stronger with a second car in their stable. I think that's a no-brainer, putting everything that happened at the Rolex aside. What happens with Meyer-Shank Racing next season in IMSA? Man, that's the greatest mystery of it all. Is there's, you hear, could they try and get one of the Porsche could they try and get one of the Porsche customer cars that are going to be made available? That would make sense, I think. They're a strong team. They have some funding behind them. That seems like it seems like it would be a good connection. Maybe this is just me hoping a little bit too much, but I think they would be a really good candidate to run the Alpine in North America. Alpine has been, rumored that, they would like to potentially bring their car over. It might not be next year. It might be 2025, but you have a team that has run basically it kind of looks like they're twins, the Acura and the Alpine. There's pretty striking similarities there. And you have a strong team in Meyer Shank Racing that has won championships at multiple levels in North America. What better team than them to introduce Alpine into the mix? But it all remains to be seen. Could they leave IMSA completely? Potentially. Could they go back to GTD Pro, GTD? I doubt it. But I guess it could be a possibility. I don't know. Do you have what are your thoughts, Chris?
So I'll tell you one thing. They're not going to be racing an Alpine and IMSA next year.
Yes.
I don't know. I actually, because you say the writing's on the wall that they probably wouldn't be returning to race an Acura in GTP next year. I don't maybe know if
they win the championship, maybe Acura, it would be pretty hard to let go of them. Maybe maybe they find a way to have a third car.
But here's the other interesting thing. They're still racing Hondas in IndyCar. Now, how strong is their connection to Honda and IndyCar, I guess, is the next question. If they still have strong ties with Honda, then that leads me to believe they wouldn't compete against Honda in an IMSA championship. If they're not, then they could certainly go down the Penske route and race Chevrolet/GM and IndyCar and then race Porsche and IMSA. I don't think there's anything stopping them from doing that. I think if I had to put money on something right now, I would guess that they'll be back with Acura next year. I don't know for sure. I have zero grounds on that. I don't know how much the relationship is soured after Daytona. At the end of the day, they're still a very strong team.
They'd be leading the points if it wasn't for that penalty.
Right. I mean, this is, so I don't know. I guess that's where my money sits right now, is I personally think we're going to see them back with Acura next year in IMSA, if they're back in IMSA at all. If they're not in IMSA, that's a whole separate thing. I don't see them switching to another manufacturer in IMSA, though. And it would certainly, if that was the case, it would certainly be a big blow to the series. Meyer Shank/Mike Shank has been a staple of IMSA and Grand Am before that for well over a decade. So it would certainly be a big loss, and we'll have to see. I'll throw my dart on the board. We'll see if that dart sticks.
I want to add another tie here, just between Alpine and Meyer Shank. Alpine in Formula One has some pink on their car. Meyer Shank Racing has the Auto Nation sponsorship.
That's a bit of what we call a grade A reach. Yeah, Kyle says it's a bit overlooked that Shank has won the past 2 Daytona 24s, Petit Le Mans last year, as well as the championship, yet might get shut out because of WTR. I don't think it's overlooked, because they're an extremely strong team. If Acura dropped them as a team, that's Acura's loss, as far as I'm concerned, because you're, like you said, Kyle, you're dropping the team that's won the Rolex 24 the past 2 years in a row, Petit Le Mans last year, the championship last year. They have an extremely strong driver lineup. That's my next question, is where would their driver lineup go? You have a bunch of free agents on the market at that point that are very strong, and I'm sure other teams would want to take advantage of them. And all of that to get a second Wayne Taylor Racing with Andretti Autosport car? Maybe, but I don't know. It's a very tough situation. I personally would assume that they would just add an additional car and
Yeah,
have 3 cars. Um,
I think I
with
think I think if the Rolex never happened, this isn't a talking point right now, is it?
yeah,
I I I, I don't think anybody would really be talking about this. It would be oh
right.
oh cool, Acura's running 3 cars next year.
Yeah, the question at that point becomes how much did the relationship sour between HPD and Meyer Shank?
Yeah,
Which, if I want to guess, not enough to the point where they haven't lost IndyCar as a tie-in IndyCar. If Meyer Shank came out and said, "Well, we don't have HPD supporting us in IndyCar next year," I think that's sort of that's a little concerning. But the fact that they are continuing that partnership,
that did they
the only
renew that
question,
partnership though, or is they still locked into a contract there? That's
I believe
that
they
could
renewed it. Kyle, correct me because you would know that more than me. This is why I'm not
yeah.
talking about IndyCar on this show anymore. I believe they renewed it, but I'm not 100% confident because they have.
I don't know how the IndyCar how those manufacturer contracts work on a. I
Yeah, I'll say
assume
the
that they're
same.
multi-year deals, but it's I'm sure they're not super public about how long those multi-year deals are either.
Yeah. And a couple of people commenting specifically about Colin Braun. Feel bad for Colin Braun if they don't come back. He earned that seat. Absolutely. Colin Braun,
Yep.
I said for many seasons, was, punching well under his weight. He was kind of, I don't want to say stuck in an LMP3 car. I mean, obviously, he was affiliated with Core Autosport through thick and thin. It was great to see him there, but he is really a top class prototype driver. And I'm really glad that he finally got that seat this year. Just kind of unfortunate that he's maybe stuck throughout all this other controversy that's to no fault of his own. All right, so I want to get off that topic. I want to talk about our last thing here. I want to do a bit of a WEC preview for Fuji. Also, I don't know if this is the great thing about having a camera now is you can see how much of an ergonomical nightmare my desk is. I was talking to you about this yesterday, but it's like this is the reach around to get my mouse because my wheel's like right here, which you can't see. But anyway, WEC preview for Fuji. I'm not going to do this every week. And that actually reminds me, I didn't talk about the format for this show, which is basically every other week, except for if there is a race in IMSA or the WEC that weekend, in which case we'll do a review of that race. So what that means is, assuming everything goes well, I think there's a little bit of scheduling uncertainty still, but we should have episodes after tonight for the next 2 weeks, because next week we have a WEC review to do for Fuji, and then the
Battle of the
following week we
Bricks.
have the Battle of the Brickyard for the first time since 2014. So we'll be hopefully on for the next 2 weeks, but then everything after that, off season, it's going to be bi-weekly on Tuesdays, 8 p.m. All right, so WEC at Fuji, the penultimate race of the 2023 season. If I have to throw a prediction out there for Hypercar, easy one, put $50 on Toyota. All right, they've won every single year at Fuji that they've raced there. They did stop racing there 2020 and 21, I believe, due to the COVID pandemic. But they've won every other year there, 2012 to now, except for 2015 when Porsche won. And that's when they were running the slightly outdated TS040, as crazy as that is to say, because that car was only 2 years old at the time. In terms of, so yeah, I think they're the favorite for this race for sure. In terms of BOP, I don't really want to talk about this for every race, but considering we did talk about BOP earlier, I'll just give quick updates about what's changed, just so you can know about it going into the race, but I probably won't make a habit of it. Cadillac, Ferrari, and Porsche all running a bit heavier than they were at Monza. The Peugeot on the flips, I got to get better at saying Peugeot, so there you go. Before I get yelled at, because
Yeah, there's going to be comments about it
poor
probably.
old Jim Roller was getting kind of cooked during the Le Mans when he was on the world feed. So Peugeot is running a little bit lighter than they were at Monza. On the flip side, every manufacturer except for Glickenhaus, Peugeot, and Van Wall have a bit of a power increase. The other three will stay the same. For the maximum stint energy, Cadillac, Ferrari, and Porsche all see increases, while the Glickenhaus, Peugeot, and Toyota and Van Wall all have decreases in the maximum stint energy. And then finally, the last change that I mentioned earlier in the episode, the Peugeot has their minimum front wheel hybrid deployment speed dropped from 150 kilometers per hour to 135 kilometers per hour in dry conditions only. So if it rains in the race, it stays at 150. Dry conditions 135. So they'll be getting on the power or on the hybrid power on those front wheels a little bit earlier as long as the race stays dry. Should help them a little bit with tire wear. I don't know. It's not that much of a difference. And then no BoP change for Monza and GTM, which is good. As for points right now, obviously 2 races to go. Really starting to talk about the championship at this point. The number 8 Toyota still holds a 23-point lead over the number 7 Toyota and number 51 Ferrari, which are both tied for second place in the championship. That's despite them only winning 1 race this season, which was way back at the second race in Portimao. That means there are still 65 points up for grabs by winning the last 2 races, plus the pole positions in each. Pole position gets you 1 bonus point in the World Endurance Championship. With that 23-point lead, the number 7 Toyota crew, I know after Le Mans with their DNF and consequently no points, was saying we're really out of the championship hunt. I don't really think so. I think that, there's still a 65-point swing on the cards here. It's going to take a lot. I'll admit that. The number 8 Toyota is going to have some really poor luck. But with Bahrain being an 8-hour race for the finale, there are additional points up for grab. I believe it's 38 points at Bahrain for winning versus 25 for winning Fuji this weekend. As I mentioned, in second place in Hypercar, the number 7 Toyota and number 51 Ferrari are tied. Sitting only 7 points behind them, though, is the number 50 Ferrari. So we got a nice little 3-way battle for second going on right now in the Hypercar category. For LMP2, the final LMP2 championship and the World Endurance Championship, as they'll be going away for the full-time season next year. The battle for the championship is 10 points right now between the number 41 WRT and the Le Mans winning 34 Inter-Europol team right now. Still well within contention for that one. WRT and Inter-Europol have been throwing on quite the show this year. And then GTM, the title was already clinched at Monza. Plain and simple, Corvette Racing has been extremely dominant this year. 2 races early, they already clinched, or I guess 3 races early. No, 2 races early. They already clinched the championship. If you want an idea of how dominant they've been, after Monza, they have 145 points in the championship, and second place is the Iron Dames Porsche. They have 67 points. So they've more than doubled in the final year for that category before they switched to GT3. And also 7-point battle for second in that class as well between the Iron Dames Porsche and the TF Sport Aston Martin and the Dempsey Proton Porsche. So another 3-way battle for second there. Weather, I mentioned this one earlier. Looks like we might be seeing some rain. That track historically has thrown a lot of rain on the table. Looks like we might get some this weekend. It's very hard to predict, though, for that track because you're sitting right on the silhouette of Mount Fuji, and weather around mountains is very hard to predict. So might get some rain. It doesn't look like it's going to be any heavy downpour, no typhoon or anything like that on the cards. So just keep an eye out for that one. Might be a little bit interesting. And obviously, we'll do a full recap about that race on next week's episode. More details on the points, full race rundown of what happened. I think that race starts at 10 p.m. Eastern time for those of us on the East Coast of the United States, like Stu and myself. So I'll be trying to make the long trek to 4 a.m. on that one. And if I fall asleep, then we'll have to catch up before the episode. All right. Let's see. I was going to go back to any comments before the end of the episode. So I guess let's just say that right now. If you have any comments or any questions you want to ask before the end of the episode, feel free to drop those right now. We'll see if I can get to any of those before the end of the episode. But while you do that, I just want to give a reminder again that the format for this show, every other week, so bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern time, with the exception being any time that there is an IMSA or WEC race, we will do a recap episode the following Tuesday. So if there's a race on Sunday for IMSA, for example, like you said, we have the Battle of the Bricks coming up. we should be able to do an episode on that Tuesday just to recap that race. And then again, we'll reset 2 weeks after that before the next episode. I think that gives us a good middle ground because the news, I feel like in sports car racing right now, is either nothing or everything. And I feel like last week was a pretty heavy news story week. But then when we roll on to this week, it's not quite as much. So I think every other week is sort of the sweet spot for news when it comes to sports car racing right now.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to mention as well, you mentioned questions. If you have a question heading into a week or coming out of a race or anything, then you can message, or I was going to say tweet. What do you say? Mention us on X. That's at Rain Race Podcast.
Yep. I should have thrown a little ticker at the bottom. I'll get that for next week's show. At the bottom, yeah, at Rain Race Podcast, or alternatively, you can just DM me on Twitter at GTRainYT. I don't know if you have your DMs open on Twitter as well, but DM any one of us or reply to a comment. We should be able to get those questions. Or if you're on YouTube, I'm going to throw a community post up before every episode on my community tab. So feel free to get your questions in there as well. And I'll try to get to those because I do know that this time slot's kind of unfriendly for us, for our UK-based listeners. I do apologize for that. It just, for us, both being on the East Coast of the United States, sort of worked out the best. But like I said, if you're based in Europe, or even if you're not, and you still have any questions you want to ask, just put them in the community tab, put them on Twitter, and we'll be sure to try to get to those on the next episode. Anyway, I think we're going to wrap it up for this one. Good hour and 37-minute episode for the first one. Yeah. Like I said, we'll be back next week, though, to recap the WEC race at Fuji. You never know with the sports car racing landscape. I'm sure we'll have some massive news story that comes out that we have to talk for an hour and a half about, or maybe not. Maybe we'll get that the following week. Anyway, any final comments from you?
No, looking forward to Fuji. Not looking forward to the time that it's on at, but, you can't win them all.
Yeah, that's the way it is with a world championship. Anyway, thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of the Rain Race Podcast. Hope to see you next week for another episode. Take care.